Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello everyone, and welcome to Bouncing Back, the Personal Resilience Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I am your host, Joanna. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome back to the show. Have you ever wondered why some people seem to be able to weather criticism or setbacks with ease, while others are deeply affected by the opinions and expectations of those around them? Well, the answer may depend on several factors, but a huge part of it lies in where we look for validation, guidance, and self-worth, or more simply put, our frame of reference. So in this episode, we're unpacking the science behind external and internal referencing and how they affect our personal resilience. And joining us in this conversation today is teacher and author Paul Dunion, who is currently a senior faculty member at Mobius Next Practice Institute. Paul holds a doctoral degree in counseling and consulting psychology and has been in private practice for 45 years, employing an existential modality and somatic approach to treating trauma. So we're extremely fortunate to have him here with us today. So welcome to the show, Paul.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you.
It's really wonderful to have you here. But before we begin, do tell us about your background and what compelled you to pursue teaching and psychological healing.
I think what motivated me to step into teaching is I actually came out of college, ran to New York City and had a job buying dresses. And it soon became clear it was not my calling. And I ended up teaching at a prep school after I left there and discovered how much it really fulfilled me to teach. And it was also a reminder of how much of a learner or student I remained in my life after the classroom. The healing piece, I ended up teaching at a small college. I was teaching philosophy, especially existentialism. And a colleague came to me and said, "Are you aware there is a school of psychology that is existential?" And I said, "No." And that did it. I went off and got a doctoral degree and thought, this is the direction I want to go. I just don't want to think about this stuff. I want to apply it.
Yeah, I love that story so much because it's just a really good reminder that sometimes the wrong step that you're taking, that just means you're a step closer to finding the right step. So thank you for sharing that with us. But with regards to the topic for today, could you tell us about some common misconceptions about personal resilience?
Yeah, I think some common misconceptions is that it is about significant capacity to adapt, comply, read expectations, respond to expectations meaningfully, which, these things are not necessarily bad things, but they don't, in my experience, really strengthen a capacity to be resilient.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that serves as an excellent preface for our topic for today. But before we go further into detail, I would love to get to know you better. So this is Have You Met Paul? And my first question for you is, what is your favorite book?
I would say lots of books are my favorite books, but one that touches my life again and again is Eternal Echoes by John O'Donohue.
Oh, what do you like about that book?
I believe he dresses the notion of belonging in a way that I've never seen before or after it, actually. Yeah.
That sounds like a really thought-provoking one.
Yeah, I noticed that the people I've worked with through the years, they imply or infer that belonging is an important concept for them, but they don't name it. And so often I'll say, I think you're talking about your belonging. And eyes light up, right? There's a sense of, yes, this is about belonging. But for some reason, it doesn't seem to be in the common nomenclature when a person's describing their psychological journey.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting to me as well because it is pretty relevant to our topic for today in the sense of, some people feel belonging more intensely than others. I feel like, but we'll talk about that later on in the episode. For now, I would love to know, what movie have you been enjoying recently?
One that I called to mind was Oppenheimer. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good one. I just love how it was shot. What do you love about it?
I enjoyed the crisis that success brought the hero to. Yeah.
Yeah. And what about podcasts? Are there any that you're listening to at the moment?
There isn't. No, most of the time I'm writing.
Yeah. Well, that's fair. Most of the time I'm writing too as a podcast host. And what about more role models? Are there anyone that you looked up to either in your professional life or personal life?
Yeah. I mean, I have been blessed with mentors since I was 29. I've had 5 or 6 very significant mentors. I remember I had one in my doctoral program, and I was studying transpersonal psychology with him. And he had just given papers back that we had written, and he had a lot of great feedback. But his last question on his feedback to me was, "Am I paranoid, or do you look at me a lot?" And I went up to him after the class and I said, "I wanted to answer your question." He said, "Yeah, what's going on?" I said, "My best intuition is you really know how to carry masculine personal power, and I don't know how. So I've been looking at you." And he said, he said to me, "Knock yourself out."
I love that so much. So did you end up being able to learn how to harness that personal masculine energy from him?
I learned a certain measure of it. Yes, I did. And a lot of it was his capacity to listen and not react.
Mm,
I
that's an
found
interest. Yeah.
I found very valuable.
Yeah. I think I need some of that personal masculine energy because I've been told that I react too much. And I am 26 and I'm starting to get like reaction frown lines on my forehead because I react so much. So
Yeah.
I'm going to need to learn from you, Paul.
Well, I know a little bit about it, but it's a lifelong learning.
Yeah, for sure. And my last question for today, not for today, my last question for this segment is, has there been a course or a class that has stuck with you to this date?
I think the last one that touched me was a couple of years ago. My wife and I were studying with a Celtic poet, and one evening, as he was talking, he mentioned the notion of the generous moment, and he kept talking like someone would say, "Pass the salt." And when I heard that phrase, the generous moment, I stopped breathing. And I just finished the 300-page manuscript on the generous moment. Oh, I
Oh,
mean, it really called to me. I needed to know, what is this thing he's calling the generous moment? And so now
what?
there's a manuscript entitled "Living Intimately, Devotionally Serving the Generous Moment."
Yeah. And what did you learn from that experience?
I learned that there's a way in which we can step out of having an adversarial relationship with life. Meaning, I don't have to get caught in the options of, I'm either triumphing over life or I'm its victim. There are other options, and some of that is what we're talking about tonight. Yeah.
Yeah. That resonates with me very, very strongly, particularly because I come from Singapore, which is a country that really prides itself on, I guess, culture-wise, there's a lot of success and failure. These concepts are really, really strong. And I don't think that that is unique to this country. I think that it is intertwined in a lot of cultures. And yeah, I think we can definitely talk about this later on in the interview. But with regards to external and internal referencing and how it affects our resilience, for starters, how would you define personal resilience?
I use a fellow by the name of Brian McLern's definition that I like a lot. He said it's the capacity to withstand and recover from hardship and difficulties. And I like that a lot. It's simple, it's clear. Yeah.
And what about denial? What's your definition of that?
My definition of denial is I'm not a lack of readiness to notice what's important. Yeah. And I see it as a helpful agent to the psyche, actually.
Mm-hmm. And how would you describe the relationship between personal resilience and denial?
It's a great question. I think that it can be challenging to notice I am experiencing hardships, and I might have the propensity to deny its impact on me. Like I might be scared, I might be confused, I might be lost. So I think that's probably one of the most significant roles of denial.
Yeah, I think that that is absolutely something that a lot of us stick with, especially when we still don't quite know how to grapple with our emotions and we don't quite know how to label them.
Mhm.
And it's almost part of the process of just processing your emotions a little bit. I feel like that's something I definitely used a lot when I was younger.
Mhm.
But before we digress, how would you define external and internal referencing? What are some examples of these two concepts?
Yeah, external referencing, it mostly happens through roles, right? Oftentimes, if I ask somebody, tell me who you are, but don't name a role, they'll look at me like, what do you want me to do? Yes, I want you to tell me who you are without identifying a role. So that's one way to see external referencing. It's also a conscious focus on what are the external mores, norms, expectations, demands of me. It's a strong external focus on those kinds of dynamics. Internal referencing is a curiosity about what's going on in my inner world. And what got me really excited about writing about, in fact, the first two chapters of this new book are about internal referencing, is that I noticed so many important concepts like love, belonging, trust, authority, they're typically externally referenced. They're described as happening between people. And so I have really enjoyed taking those concepts and making them internal experiences: self loyalty, self belonging, self authority, self trust. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And what role does external or internal referencing play in someone's tendency to be in denial or be resilient?
Well, if I'm internally referenced, it automatically should up some of the control of how I'm going to respond to life, because I'm interested in how, for example, the quality of my self trust, which I define as holding two beliefs. If I trust myself, I believe one, that I'll let myself know my own truth, which is a powerful, resilient tool. And the second belief is, I believe I'll be kind to me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And, in researching this topic, I was really curious to know, is one inherently better than the other?
Well, I mean, if you ask the average person in a Western culture, they'd probably say externally referenced is the way to go. Uh, and and there's some good thinking, especially by Susan Cain's book, Quiet, where she explores extroversion and how that leans into and generates more being externally referenced. My bias is that the starting point needs to be in the internally referenced point whenever possible, because that's the place I do have more control and more freedom.
Yeah. And so tell us a bit more about some ways in which an external referencing or internal referencing would show up in day-to-day life.
Well, I mean, as a teacher in a classroom for years, it would show up there. I mean, I could tell whether my students were ready to report their thinking, their vision, or whether or not they want to regurgitate something they either read or heard from me. And I noticed the class always became more dynamic and creative when they were expressing themselves in an internally referenced way.
Yeah. And do you have any examples of what that sounds like?
Uh, I think there's more passion when it's internally referenced. Of course, there's more risk because I'm not quoting an expert or an authority figure. And so I find that the more there can be psychological safety between two people or a group or a team, people tend to get more internally referenced if there's more psychological safety because there's more risk.
Right. And what does the research say about a balance between external and internal referencing and how this affects someone's ability to adapt and be resilient?
Well, I mean, I think for sure it is a combination. I mean, it's like the capacity to adapt is a critical tool. The key I like is my adaptation leading me anywhere close to self-betrayal? If it's leading me close to self-betrayal, it's no longer as useful a tool as it could be. Uh, and that's an important consideration.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've never thought of it that way, because I was always brought up to kind of believe, you know, in in life you've got to succeed in a certain way, right? Going back to that concept of really, really strong notions of success and failure, and doing these certain things or achieving these certain things in life is considered success. But at what point is it actually considered success in on your own terms if you're achieving all these so-called milestones, but then your mental health is, for example, your mental health is potentially not at its best, or just probably maybe at its worst, for example.
Right.
um yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think the classic example of that is Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman. Willie Loman is the epitome of what it meant to buy into a system and experience the depths of self-betrayal.
Yeah. And in researching for this topic as well, I found that some studies have suggested that social comparison can both be motivating and detrimental, which, you know, again, everything's kind of like a balance, and it's like a double-edged sword sometimes. So how would you say this notion of social comparison ties into external referencing?
Well, again, if it's excessive, it's going to push me toward self-betrayal again. Uh, In fact, when I sit with a new group for teaching, I suggest they pay attention to three dynamics internally that could be expressed. One, how much they're comparing and contrasting themselves to others. And then I'll say to them, choose, when you notice you're doing it, choose to continue or interrupt it. And then I'll say, secondly, notice a desire to compete with other people. And then choose to do it or interrupt it. And lastly, notice some attachment to being impressive. And then decide to do it or interrupt it. So this, the refocusing of the choice hopefully brings the person back to the self-empowerment and the self-loyalty.
Yeah. And I do have a question about what might be a good exercise or practice to do with regards to developing that internal referencing. Just because there are a lot of people who have grown up in that, system where your external referencing is what I call, I guess, the standard. You're seeking validation and guidance from others. When we go to work, we have probation and we have like KPIs to hit, and all these things are external referencing. Doesn't mean that it's particularly or inherently bad. It's just the way it is, and it kind of trains us almost to default to that frame of reference, rather than trusting yourself. So I'm curious about what advice you have for that.
Regarding what it means to be in a position where I'm sensitive to the expectations and the norms of the culture, and how to manage that and manage my internal referencing at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, I'm increasingly biased to pausing and notice what's happening in the body. Because the thing I don't want to sacrifice when I'm taking my reads of the external world is my capacity to be present. And I become more present to myself when I'm aware, for example, of interior sensations. So let's say I'm listening to someone speak, I pause, I breathe, I notice my chest is tight. I notice my breathing is shallow. That itself is giving me more proximity to myself, while not necessarily judging what's in front of me or excluding it or avoiding it, but simply inviting a sense of presence while this other activity is occurring.
Yeah, that sounds like it would be really, really helpful. And that's something I struggle with at the moment and definitely have to work on myself. But I'm also really interested to hear your thoughts about the effect that your frame of reference would have on your relationships, whether it's personal or professional. What is the impact that your frame of reference would have on the relative strength or health of your relationships?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll give you a short story. So some years ago, my wife and I went to Thailand. Thailand's an introverted culture. I'm introverted. Within 48 hours, I didn't want to go home. Because of what it means to be introverted in an extroverted culture, there are constant invitations not to be internally referenced, because almost automatically an introvert is somewhat internally referenced. So I came home and I said to my wife, I've been trying to live an extroverted definition of social interaction my whole life. I'm going to stop. She said, what are you going to do? I said, well, I'm going to start with you. When we're together, and what priority is not mostly to be with you. It's mostly to be with myself in the most clear and compassionate way possible in your presence. She didn't think she liked it. And after a few weeks, she said to me, oh my God, I have more of you. Well, of course she does, because I'm starting with where I can make the offering, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I've been living that now for 15 years, no matter where I am.
Wow, I love that. That's really impactful, and yeah, it's really illustrative. A really illustrative example of how things can transform when you start using that internal frame of reference. And yeah, I would love to do that myself. I feel like I'm more of an ambivert. I don't know if that's
More of a what?
an ambivert, like in the
Ambivert.
middle. I'm not sure if that's like scientifically validated. But I do describe myself that way because sometimes I am more of an introvert, and largely I am, but I also can get very extroverted if it's with the right people. But I'm not going to ask you about that because that's not what I'm here to do. But thanks for sharing that story. That was really interesting. And what about with communication and boundaries? How does internal and external referencing influence somebody's ability to do that?
So I think to be excessively externally referenced, what can happen is the person gets a little lost and confused in the external dynamic and might not even know that they need a boundary. So that can be a price to pay. Because if I'm not adequately saying no to what's happening to me in the world, obviously I could be hurt and harmed in some way.
Yeah, I definitely have that experience. I will say it right now. I'll say it with my full chest. I am very externally referenced because of, I suppose, just like the way I was brought up. And yeah, I think maybe it's also got to do with the fact that women tend to be a bit more submissive in nature and tend to just go with the rules. Obviously, sweeping statement. So, but I am externally referenced most of the time, and I do have a lot of trouble saying no because the primary issue is that I have trouble even identifying when to say no. So, what are some prompts or reflective questions I can ask myself to figure out where my boundaries lie?
So I think the first key is to pause and to breathe. If I stay in the dynamic, I'm not getting enough internal information about what I need. So if I can just pause and breathe. And I like the idea, if I don't know if I need a boundary, that equals I do. Yeah, I don't want to mess around with too much ambiguity when it comes to boundaries, because their major purpose is safety. Yeah, it's not a place where I want a lot of ambiguity. But there can be internal cues like my gut's tight, my breathing is shallow. I notice my shoulders are up and forward. It's likely telling me I'm uncomfortable. So I at least can claim that truth. I notice I'm not feeling comfortable with what you just did. That kind of thing.
Yeah, I do notice that I do have these responses at times, and I have in the past already, recognized these signs and set boundaries. However, I also, as I imagine other people would, struggle with the feeling of safety. Sometimes you may not want to set boundaries because you're not feeling particularly safe. So, what is your advice for those situations?
Let me see if I hear you. There's a situation where I'm feeling unsafe, but if I set a boundary, I may get more unsafe. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, yes, actually, to add on to that, sorry
Yeah.
if it's getting a bit convoluted, but to add on to that, this is not in reference to any situation where there is physical harm that might ensue, or any domestic violence acts, anything like that, but more to do with the feeling of being not safe,
Yeah.
rather than the
If I have the
actual
feeling
potential.
of not being safe and I'm not sure I can employ an adequate boundary to provide it, compliance and adaptation might be advisable,
Mm-hmm.
at least temporarily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that makes me, because I'm just catching myself now. This is me being externally referenced. And in that moment, subconsciously, I was thinking like, okay, but I need to get validation for the times that I have failed to set boundaries because I felt unsafe and I needed more time to reflect on whether I need to set this boundary. Um, yeah. So my next question for you is, what advice do you have for those who may focus on internal referencing too heavily? On the other hand, what kind of issues may they face?
Um, Getting excessively internally referenced, I think, happens mostly out of a sense of curiosity, or also out of a sense of wanting to postpone action. And for example, if I can remember that taking a risk is a courageous act, and regardless of the outcome, I will be kind to myself. The idea that I need to get absorbed in self examination and self analysis begins to diminish, because I don't need to avoid the risk so much, because I'm willing to take it. And I've got a commitment, and this takes practice over time, that regardless of outcome, I'll do my best to be kind to myself. Sometimes people will say to me, I fear the risk. And I'll say, no, you probably don't. You probably fear what will you do to you if there's an unfavorable outcome. And most times people will say to me, I get it. You're right. I'm not that afraid of the risk, but I am afraid that if there's an unfavorable outcome, what will I do with me?
Yeah. Um, yeah, that's really interesting. And, as I have made so apparent in this episode, as an externally referenced person, I find it really difficult to understand what it means to really be that far deep into an internal reference um, frame of mind, I suppose. So I'm really curious to know if internal referencing also plays a part in the the health, or the state of relationships, I suppose. Is there like potentially a negative impact on those areas?
I think, for example, of an intimate relationship, either in a partnership or a spousal relationship, or just really good friends, as the unity of two distinct, unique human beings. Now, that's a little bit paradoxical, but if they're not two unique individuals, then the likelihood is something similar to codependencies going on. That is, somebody's taking their cues from the other person about how to be. Huh? So I think to be internally referenced enough to say, I'm going to honor my uniqueness within my relationship with you and honor yours the best I can. So automatically it becomes an issue of, are we willing to be students of how to hold diverse beliefs, diverse preferences, and diverse values?
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. I think now would be a really good time to talk about some of the everyday application of external and internal referencing. So, what habits would you recommend practicing to maintain a balance of external and internal referencing?
Well, I wouldn't actually promote a lot of external referencing, since most people I have met are great at it. They're already very good. The internal referencing, again, is a lot about pausing, a lot about breathing, and focusing internally. But there are several dynamics that I highly recommend getting more and more familiar with. Loyalty is typically an externally referenced concept that happens between people. So I say, pay attention to self-loyalty, meaning, are you living faithfully to your heart's desire and your values? Right? I have found, I said this a couple of weeks ago, and somebody thought I was off my rocker, but I said, I have found the most valuable experience in my life in the last 10, 15 years has been self-betrayal. And the person said, why? I said, because I have immediate information about where I don't belong and what I've done that I have to do differently. So it's not like self-loyalty and self-betrayal are, not so good things. They're incredibly helpful to get me closer to myself. So
Yeah.
that's one concept, self-loyalty. And I mentioned self-trust. Do I actually believe I'll let myself know my own truth? Do I actually believe I'll be kind to myself?
Yeah, thank you for the compliment, by the way, earlier when you said that most people that you know are really good at external referencing. I'll take that. I'll take that win.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So, what are the biggest positive effects of placing more emphasis on self-loyalty and self-trust and just being okay with that?
Well, you're right. I mean, because what you're getting at is it can create a little of anxiety to shift paradigms, right? I'm so used to how loyal I am to my friends, and now introduce the notion of how loyal am I to myself. So it does take, you got to grease the wheel here a little bit, because we're just so accustomed to doing it as an outside job and not an inside job. What can help is to notice that the inside job typically makes me more creative, more productive on the outside job. Yeah. So it's not like something's being terribly sacrificed.
Yeah, I really like that idea because I've heard a lot of the time that, I think, well, I feel like in the positive psychology realm, we always hear now, like, you've got to put yourself first. You can't take care of other people until you take care of yourself. And this isn't limited to the psychology world, of course. It's got into pop psychology now and like on social media. And it is a very common notion to repeat. But I've never really had a clear understanding of what that means. Like I've just heard it, and it sounds like a very vague, abstract concept. But I think bringing external referencing and internal referencing into the picture now really, really helps to illustrate, like, instead of thinking you've got to be selfish and you've got to do things for yourself and point blank, that's it. It's more of just, you have, like, to be clearer, you got to be loyal to yourself. You've got to do things for yourself. You've got to trust yourself, work with yourself, like the various parts of yourself as a team. Because, sometimes your ambitious self may not be thinking about the other parts of yourself. You've got to, like, gather those little bits of yourself. I don't know if anyone else thinks about, like, things that way. Gather all the little bits about yourself and be like, okay, let's huddle, guys. Let's do a little conference, a little meeting. Like, what can we do? What can we do to help ourselves?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A very famous Sufi, Rumi, wrote a poem called The Guest House, and basically he said just what you just said. whoever shows up, welcome. Whoever shows up internally, welcome that part. Don't turn them away. See what they have to offer. The starting point, the starting point of self, when my granddaughter was a teenager, I said to her one night, tell me what's most important to you right now, because I'm thinking what's really important to you are your friends. And she said, that's right, Grandpa. And I said, okay, so tell me what a good friend is. And she's introverted, so she lowered her head and was breathing. And she said to me, Grandpa, that's a very heavy question. I said, let's see if we can make sense of it. Okay, she said, what is it? I said, you fly down to Miami with your father, right? What does the airline attendant tell you to do with the oxygen mask? She goes, she does tell me what to do with it, but I'm not sure. I said, she tells you to put it on yourself first. She lowered her head, she lifted her arms, and she yelled at me, Grandpa, I'm not living that way yet. Once I said to her, you have time, honey. You have time. But she was getting it, that the power to serve others, like the oxygen mask, happens because of the self-care that I'm offering. Right, she got it.
Yeah. That's absolutely correct. And thank you so much for sharing all of your expertise with us. This has been really, really insightful, and I mean this with 100% genuinity. That's not the word. I mean this sincerely. I mean this with 100% sincerity. This has been so helpful to me as an externally referenced person, which is not uncommon, as we've already established. And so I'm sure that it'll be really helpful to other externally referenced listeners here. Welcome, and thank you for listening. We hope that you have found this informative and insightful. And now let's move on to the open mic segments. This will be your opportunity to talk about anything that you're passionate about, and it doesn't have to be related to the topic. So the floor is entirely yours. Take it away, Paul.
Okay. I think what's been getting my attention a lot lately is that once I have a commitment to be internally referenced, what is that going to look like in terms of creating a relationship with life? And the first thing I started exploring was the power of anthropomorphizing life, meaning to bring thou, what I call thou-ness to life, rather than itness. Right? So that I'm going to have a close relationship with it, right? Such that I'm going to step out of that dynamic I think I mentioned earlier of I'm either triumphing over life or I'm its victim. So many of us get caught in that wedge. There's a place to befriend it and get more intimate with it. And there are two critical questions that I like a lot in terms of stepping out of I'm either going to conquer life or it's going to conquer me, because that's adversarial and it burns up so much energy. And the two questions are this: what am I asking of you, life? And what are you asking of me? And it dawned on me is exactly how Viktor Frankl took care of himself in a concentration camp. Rather than trying to conquer that or be its victim, he asked the question, what is this asking of me? And then decided it's asking me to serve my comrades. I like the example because if he could have done it there, hopefully I can do it anywhere. Yeah.
Yeah. And have you tried this out yet?
Oh, I try to live it constantly. Yeah. My ego quickly can get to what am I asking of this situation? And then I need to pause and what is this situation asking of me?
Yeah.
That's more of a soul question, not an ego question.
And how impactful has that been in your life?
Very, because it has diminished the illusion that I can do everything through willpower and what I want. And now I'm much more curious about what the situation has for me. What is it asking for? What's it requesting of me? It also refines my capacity to serve.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Well, thank you for sharing that with us, Paul. It's been such a pleasure. If our listeners want to find out more about you and what you do, where can they go?
Paul Dunion, www.pauldunion at the website. Yeah.
That's all good. We'll put that in the show note. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
You have been listening to Bouncing Back, the Personal Resilience Science Insights podcast produced by the Life Management Science Labs. Listen to episodes from LMSL's 10 Life Management Perspectives on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or other podcasting apps on your smartphone. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it and us grow to bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website, pr.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Joanna. Thanks for tuning in.